All right, we're going to get started. Welcome. You are joining W.A.P, What About the Planet? We hope we got your attention with the title. This is another installment of our Green Table Talks. This is a partnership between Black Millennials for Flint, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Climate Action Campaign. And we are so excited that you are with us. There's a pandemic going on. There's a crazy, election happening, and we know you're juggling a lot, so we really appreciate it. My name is Elise Nelson Leary. I work on policy and partnerships at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I will be moderating today's chat. Just a few housekeeping things. If you look into the chat, you'll see just the handles and the emails of our panelists. Feel free to reach out to them. We will be recording this. We will post this later on our YouTube channel if you want to come back to it or share it with colleagues. And we only have 1 hour. So I'm going to try to keep us on track as we're going through this. And if you have questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or to submit them through the Q&A function, and we will get to them at the end. Okay, so let's start. So this July, the National Geographic did a wonderful piece featuring 4 leaders of color who are really serious about expanding the environmental movement, making it more inclusive, and we are excited to have those featured folks with us today, and we're going to continue the conversation. So I just want to hand it over to them to just introduce themselves. Can you just share with our viewers something that they wouldn't have learned in the article about you, or maybe something that your colleagues don't know? Let's start with Brianna.
Thank you so much, Elise, and it is great to be here with you all. This awesome group and everybody else who's viewing as well. My name is Brianna Amingwa. I am here in Philadelphia. I work in Southwest Philadelphia as an environmental education supervisor. So I manage an education program at a 1,000-acre wildlife refuge. I'm working to directly connect students who live in the area with the nature and resources right outside their door, and fostering a really strong connection with the community as well. It's kind of our main effort. Something you might not know about me is I also have this other secret little pipe dream. I've been riding horses for a while. I hooked up with a guy when I was younger, like about 14, who was a mentor to me. He's a Black horseman, and started riding horses. And so my other little side pipeline dream is doing the same thing I do right now, but with horses and the environment, and bringing it all together and getting black kids like me on horses and riding and enjoying nature through that way as well. So thank you so much for having me today.
Awesome, thank you. Taiki.
I hail from Philadelphia.
All right.
I hail from Philadelphia as well, where I hear bad things happen. But I'm in DC currently. I'm in DC currently. I work for an international environmental organization that focuses on bird conservation. And a fact I don't think a lot of people know about me, I dance a lot to relieve stress, to feel the rhythm, to connect to the floor, so dancing is a really big thing for me. That's not in the article.
Thank you. And Elise Marie Tolbert.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Elise Tolbert. I am from the South. I'm from Tuskegee, Alabama, part of the swift growing South is what we call it. And I work in environmental health, environmental justice. Right now, I currently work to do political organizing around climate change with the goal of getting legislation passed to address the climate crisis. And I also am the founder and executive director of Next Step Up, which is a nonprofit that I started 10 years ago that provides free mentoring and tutoring to high school students to help them pursue their dreams and goals. So we give them the tools and skills and motivation needed. And like Taiki, I love to dance also. So there are some great places in DC, especially before this pandemic, where I used to dance. I like spending time outside, which is why I'm in environmental science. I have 4 dogs, technically 5. And so we spend a lot of time outside together. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. All right, so I have some questions here. I'm going to direct them to one of you, but if another panelist wants to weigh in after they finish, please feel free. And Taiki, let's begin with you. So in the piece, you talk about the concept of environmental gentrification. I just wanted to know if you could elaborate for our group how you define that concept. Are your colleagues receptive when you use the concept? And what terms do you use to talk about it with your family? Do you frame it differently?
Really great line of questions there. I'm going to go in reverse because
Okay.
actually I was having a conversation with my girlfriend about this the other day where I was talking about how I talk about race in the workplace and working at the National Audubon Society, where it is mostly white, versus working in the state representative's office in North Philadelphia, where I worked prior, where all of the employees were Black. We worked in a government office. Race was obviously always there. Like we always
Mm-hmm.
talked about it, but we never had conversations about it differently than working at Audubon.
Right.
So, I would definitely say the notion of what's understood doesn't need explaining is something that I felt when I was in a mostly Black office, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot more needs explaining because not much is understood in another office. But environmental gentrification, I think that can be observed in bike lanes in certain zip codes. That can be observed in entrances to the park that is shared by multiple communities. Why does one community, one neighborhood have better access to the park than this other community, this other neighborhood that borders it as well? We can observe environmental gentrification and where we see and where we don't see trash cans, street lights, and park benches. These things are very localized and things that when we are talking about funding for parks, those are some of those things that advocates will push up as priorities. And most of the time, those advocates do not come from communities that actually need the environmental assets, that need the environmental benefits that they're advocating for. So what comes as a result of basically white-led environmental advocacy is that it is then a white-led benefit in the outcome. So those bike lanes are only benefiting white neighborhoods, and where there were advancements to put more money in parks, those parks are, or at least where those cosmetic benefits are for parks, are seen in the white neighborhoods and not other neighborhoods.
Yeah, those are really, really good points. Anyone else want to weigh in on environmental racism and how you talk about it in the workplace versus how you talk about it with your family?
Yeah, I can weigh in here. I think that's a great question, and it's such an important question to ask. When I think about environmental racism, I think about proximity. I think about where benefits and things that are detrimental to the environment are located. And so from our history, we've learned, particularly in the United States, but you can see this globally as well, is that features of the environment that are detrimental to our health, detrimental to our wealth, detrimental to life, things that people just don't want, have historically, particularly in the United States, ended up in the communities of Black and Brown people. And this is a reality that some of our scholars in the environmental justice field, such as Dr. Robert Bullard, started to point out. He noticed, as many other scholars also started to notice, that these waste sites, toxic waste sites, household waste sites were more often than not, located in Black communities, particularly Black. That coal-fired power plants were more likely to be located in Black communities. And in addition to these things that people don't generally want because of the potential negative health consequences of the pollutants that come from them being located in those communities, there also weren't beneficial features in those communities. And beneficial features are some of the features that Taiki just talked about. Parks are great. Parks are places where there are trees. Trees are good for the air. They're great for just going out and de-stressing, which is good for your health. But those types of beneficial features are not is likely to be located in Black, brown, and low-income communities. So when I think about environmental racism, it's not about what's located in the communities. It's about who makes the decision for those to be located there. And what we often see is that the people who are making these decisions, as Taki said before, are actually have historically just been white-led decisions. And our communities have been considered the place of least resistance to just put things that are not bad, that are bad, and to not place things that are good. And the fact that they use our race to make that decision, that our race is the most powerful indicator to make that decision, is racism in the environmental field and related to the environment.
Elise, you're so on track with the question I was going to ask you next.
Oh.
Thank you for reading my mind. So can you talk a little bit about how you think that the environmental racism and environmental violence is derailing our response to this global pandemic? And how can we encourage and support what I like to call the IG or TikTok, BIPOC community to engage with really understanding both the legacy of environmental racism and how pervasive it is?
Sure, I say white supremacy has been doing what it always has been doing, and that's been continuing to take us away from reality and from truth. And reality and truth are so important, such an important step for moving forward in a positive direction. We have to first acknowledge that race has been the strongest indicator of so many outcomes that are positive and negative. Race is one of the most strongest indicator of positive maternal health outcomes. It's one of the strongest indicators of a likelihood for a good education. And it's one of the strongest indicators in the environmental field that determines whether someone will have access to a high quality environment or a low quality environment that either fosters them having a healthy, productive life or a low quality life or a harder life where they struggle. And so I think that the first thing we have to do is to do something that I really like Martin Luther King said. He said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And I think the light is in our truth, and it's in the acknowledgement of the ills that have happened. That light provides an opportunity for us to move forward in understanding and listening to the people who it has happened to, and listening to the decisions and the recommendations from the people that it's happened to. People who live in communities that have experienced what's called environmental injustice, so the lack thereof, understand what's wrong. They totally know what's wrong because they live what's wrong. And I think what is the disconnect also goes back to what Taiki said before, is that the people who are making decisions right now about righting the wrongs are still not the people who are experiencing the wrongs. So I think we have to listen to those people. The second group of people I think we must listen to are young people like us and people younger than us, because young people haven't had the experience of like being beaten down by the world as much. And so they're energetic, optimistic, and they understand their longevity on the planet, and are more likely to be able to organize, to communicate using the most modern communication tools, even, back in the day, perhaps, writing on a stone, whatever. Anywho, using those communication tools to organize. And so I think we should listen to, we should listen to young people as they make recommendations of how to move forward and support them. I think that support is really the most determining factor of the success of young movements. So I think both casting a light on the truth and then supporting those who have recommendations for how to move forward positively are the two things that we have to do.
Thank you. Taiki and Brianna, do you have any thoughts about connecting environmental racism to the response to the global pandemic, or how we can encourage IG and TikTok users to engage with fighting against environmental racism?
Sure. I think the folks on IG and TikTok and all the rest of those platforms, they know how to reach people, right? They're doing it, and they're doing an amazing job of it. And they're younger than us, older than us, all across the whole gamut. I think the first thing we need to do is listen to them and boost them. And then I think from there, we need to make that knowledge available and equip them. I think a lot of times people see it, like you mentioned, Elise, people do see what's happening in the environment around them, but they're seeing it on the very ground level. I've seen that too with my family, as you mentioned earlier, Elise, when you're talking to folks who you know, they recognize the issues, but they come to me because they're like, okay, well, you work in conservation, like, what does this actually mean? And sometimes I'm just connecting those dots for them and saying, hey, well, there's actually this law passed, and there was actually, this is strategic what's happening here. So I think we need to just connect dots for people and uplift that story, that narrative, what this whole system has done to create what we're seeing today in the environment, and then let them fly. I think that's the most important thing, is letting people tell it how they want to tell it and in the way they want to do it. So the platforms are there for us. We've got Insta, we got even, Facebook if you're old.
Yeah, this is being streamed on Facebook now. Come on.
I love Facebook. Hey, I'll count myself in that group too, but there's different audiences for every single one of those venues, and people know how to use them. So we just need to get the information out and connect those dots so that they can push the message forward in the way that they want to push it.
Thank
Seasoned millennial.
you.
Definitely verbal retweet to Elise and Brianna on that.
Verbal retweet. Okay.
Just trying to exercise.
Brianna, so you work in Philly,
Right.
and you work with kids in fourth graders. I actually spent my middle school years in the Philadelphia area, and my first exposure to going to parks was through school. We went to the Wissahickon and we, walked around and played in the ponds, or streams rather. And so I really do believe very strongly that exposing kids early in their lives really does impact how they see the world and the environment. Can you tell us what you believe has made you so successful with reaching children, and why it's so important to engage at a young age?
I would love to tell you about that, at least. Nothing makes me happier than hanging out with students. I want to give a shout out to a group of students who are watching right now. Miss Leonard, 6th grade, is watching, all the way in Utah, actually, they're watching. So that's very exciting. I'm glad to have them here. But I think, and what I'm going to really stand on my soapbox and say, is that we cannot do this work without involving youth. And when I say youth, I don't just mean, the high schoolers, the college kids. I'm talking like down to elementary school. These kids have so much value, and they have so much creativity, and they are also seeing these problems. We can't discount that at all. The reason why I think we've seen success in Philadelphia, and the program I work with is called Philly Nature Kids. The name was designed by the students. The logo was designed by the students. All of it's, we give the power back to them, and they're ready for it because they don't get those opportunities enough. When we can make room for student voice and student choice and center their experiences, then they're much more positive and much more memorable. On top of that, I think there's a misconception that Black kids, brown kids, they aren't interested in nature. It's not their thing. They don't want to get dirty. I think that's a major falsehood. I think we just need to create the space for them to have that experience and then let them decide for themselves. So what we do with Philly Nature Kids is we bring the students out every other week for the entire school year. It's repeat visits. It's not a one-time, one-off visit. And then we empower them with resources. So they're visiting the refuge, they're studying science, we're incorporating curriculum, so there's value for principals, teachers, parents, all the way down to students too, or up to students, I'll say. And we give them money. Every 4th grade class gets hundreds of dollars to decide what they want to do to help the environment. And they can pick any environment they want, the one at their school community, their community where they live, helping even the wildlife refuge to improve the habitat. And they decide what they want to do. So when we can let students make the choice and create the wheel, then they're much more impassioned to create that stewardship. I think the same is true for adults too. When folks' voice is there and they have a passion to actually solve it.
I love that. How has COVID impacted how you're engaging with students?
COVID has been a huge hurdle. We had a great year going. We had all our students ready to do their projects last spring, and there were major connectivity issues. This goes back to the systems that we have in place, right? In Philadelphia, it's one of the largest school districts in the entire country. They weren't ready for a digital change. We had no way to even reach our students because they didn't have the Chromebooks, they didn't have tablets, they didn't have Wi-Fi at their homes. So it took 2-3 months of school just for the school district to mobilize and get them equipped to even learn. So that was a really tough challenge. We ended up trying to do mailings and sending them all their supplies and things to their homes. We regrouped during the summer. We met with teachers and district professionals, and now we're back at it. Yesterday was our first round of lessons, and we took our grant money we were going to have for the buses, put it all into making a tech studio inside of the refuge, have a huge tech classroom, and we're live streaming into their Google Meets and doing it all every other week still, but just virtually now. So it looks a lot different. It feels a little different to me because I know, I miss that outside time with them, but it's still really valuable, I think. And part of that was just being able to be nimble and be flexible and be committed to staying and making that change happen, regardless of how difficult it was going to be for our staff to flip our whole kind of protocol on their head.
Well, I'm glad they have you, someone who's dedicated, because I think that is the thing, right? People who are able to be more adaptable can better support students. So this is kind of just a question to all of you. Speaking about young people makes me think about what kind of first made you, or when did you realize that you were really passionate about the environment? Was there a certain experience? Did you have a mentor? I'd love to just hear kind of personal stories. Taiki, I'll start with you.
So my start in the environment is connected to the watershed of that wildlife place that Brianna talked about. And my first job as an environmental educator, first assignment was to study. So we were going to learn how to be environmental educators. And part of that meant we were given a species to study everything you can about this. I got a bird, I got the belted kingfisher. And, I look it up in all the books and all the things. And then I come back to work next week and I got to see it in person. I got to see it like on a cattail, and I got to see it cross the creek and make the call, and just like being present for that moment. I connected it to the fact that Cobbs Creek is a neighborhood in West Philadelphia that 35 years ago was the home of the Move bombing. For those who haven't heard of it yet, it's just the city mayor and the city chief of police decided to drop a bomb on a house, and it caused a lot of damage, killed some children. But I knew that observing that kingfisher connected to the Move bombing, because why am I observing this? Why is it just me in the park? I mean, I know it's my job, but my neighbors, they look at this park every day. I know that the history of police violence, and then the connected history of systemic neglect, the lack of park benches, streetlights, and trash cans, the poor maintenance of park entrances. It made it very clear who they didn't want in the park. And so I took very seriously my responsibility that getting people into the park, getting my neighbors into the park, is part of not just reclaiming the space, but also connecting to the history of what made that space its present form, and I know that even the idea of reclaiming that space is kind of narrow, and that where I was is occupied land from the Lenape indigenous people. So looking at that kingfisher and being present for that moment connected me to an understanding and a history that motivates me and keeps my perspective in the work that I do now in environmental advocacy. When we're talking about bird conservation, we're also talking about humans. And when we're talking about land conservation, we're also talking about people, and not just the people in that moment, but the history that all of those moments and what we're looking at now is connected to.
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree. Brianna, what about you? Are there any mentors or folks that influenced you?
Sure. Yeah, for me, I was not really a big nature kid. I wasn't really into going outside. I mean, I like to ride my bike. What I really loved was animals. I wanted to save every little stray we found. I'm originally from Michigan, Metro Detroit area, so shout out to all the Flint people as well. This is why I say yes to this panel. I was like, Michigan? Is that what I heard?
Go
Flint?
Buckeyes! Go Buckeyes!
See, Elise. We were having a good vibe.
Whoa.
I went to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, so.
Oh, Elise and I went to Michigan State University, so now we have problems too.
Wow.
We actually don't have problems.
Just like the Buckeyes together, though. At least we can usually just like them. But for me, I didn't grow up where we had access to that besides riding your bike in the street. So my connection to nature came a lot later when I met, the Black horseman I mentioned earlier. His name is Doug Lewis. And he took us out riding and took us up to northern Michigan, and we went trail riding with the horses in the woods. I remember thinking, like, man, does anybody know all this is out here? Like, look at these trees. There was like a bear den. I was like, this is unreal to be in that much green and life. And so I ended up taking an internship freshman year of college, working for the Student Conservation Association, and they put me out on this wildlife refuge in the middle of the marsh to do biology work, and I hated my life. I was so scared working out there. Wading around in the mud and looking for plants. And one day during that internship, I had a chance to work with an educator there named Laura Bono. And I saw her working with the nature tots, the kids who would come, every Saturday for a program about nature. And I was like, okay, this I can do. Like, I'm not about the bio work, the field work. It's not my lifestyle, but connecting people to what the resources are, what conservationists are doing, making that real for people was something that I felt a lot more connected to. And that's what I've kind of made my goal, my work.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Elise, Marie.
I'd
You
say
mentioned that you love animals also.
I do, yeah. And I grew up outside. I actually live on a lot of land. I guess I live in the country. So growing up, I had, a story that you might think sounds stereotypical of someone in the country, but I grew up like outside in the woods and, like crossing streams and just playing outside. But I never really connected that to wanting to work in the environmental field until I was in high school and I attended a conference called the Annual Minority Health Symposium. And it's abbreviated as AMPS. And this conference was basically a conference held by a number of different HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, with biomedical programs. So it included schools like Meharry, Tuskegee University, Howard, and other schools with medical programs. And the goal of the conference was to introduce students to career fields that were related to health, particularly all minority students. And so at that conference, I sat on a session in which someone who worked from the CDC talked about Cancer Alley in Louisiana, which is an area of Louisiana where there are just ridiculously high cancer rates. And the cancer rates come from the pollution in the area that they've been experienced and exposed to. And she talked about her work there and trying to work to, remediate the area, talked about the health impacts, and really showed that the work that she was doing was through the field of public health. And it was at that moment that I realized, like, wow, public health is like being a superhero, but getting paid for it. And so I started to explore public health. I majored in environmental science at Tuskegee University because I really loved how the field connected not just to the environment, but connected to so many other facets of society and life. And I actually also spent some time doing what Brianna did. I worked with the Nature Conservancy, interned there when I was in college, and spent time in the woods, like protecting rare and endangered species. That wasn't exactly for me, but what was for me was connecting environmental health to human health. And so I decided to get a master's of public health and environmental health. And the biggest thing for me is in this field is just making sure that all people have access to a life that's healthy, that's productive, in which they can pursue their own goals and dreams. And I know the issues, for instance, like lead exposure. If someone's exposed to lead when they're really young, it impacts their ability, their developmental ability, which means they don't have the ability to pursue their goals and dreams the way that they would have otherwise, because of a factor that's completely beyond their control. And I don't think that's fair. And I know that happens more often than not to people who look like me. I don't think that's fair. And so that's what really fuels my work in this field.
Thank you. So I have another question for all of you, and this is, I wanted to really focus the first half of this on you as people, because I think oftentimes when we just talk about policy, it can be too sterile. So I think the personal narrative is like very important. But we are going to shift to kind of talking about the surge of white guilt that has really popped up in majority white nonprofit organizations, including Big Greens. And I wanted to just kind of ask, what organizations do you think are getting it right on these issues, and how, what are the most effective ways to organize and to work together as professionals in this field, to work with allies? And I'll stop there because I have so many more questions, but I'll just stop there. What organizations are getting it right, and how, and what are some effective ways that as professionals we can organize together to help impact the space? Brianna, Taiki, anyone wants to go?
Taiki, go for it. Go
Jump
for it.
in.
All right. So so I didn't put this in my introduction, but I am a board member for 4 different organizations, and I know that, and all those organizations are environmental organizations. And among like the board member community, I know that reflective of the environmental advocacy community, it is mostly white, mostly male. And, when a nonprofit is making those, when a Big Green is making the decisions of where do we put our resources, some of that influence is coming from the board. Green Leadership Trust is an organization that works with with the boards of environmental organizations, influencing them, guiding them, informing them, and hopefully making them more diverse, inclusive, and equitable, which will then help organizations. So if there's an organization that's doing it right, I think that there's a lot of things that can be done, right? Like we can also talk about how funders, big foundations, the role that they play in influencing the big catch, so to speak, grant projects that focus on climate change, but doesn't talk about climate justice. Now the organization and the members of the organization care so much about climate justice because it's, front page news, but the big donation that you got doesn't say climate justice in it at all. So there's a lot of facets of making sure the board is ready for 2050. And when I say ready for 2050, I'm saying that what this Zoom looks like will be the majority of Zooms, should we be post-pandemic, that is. Or if Zooms are still cool. 2050, the people of the global majority, who we call minorities today, will be the majority. That's basically what I mean. And so what are organizations doing today to be ready for 2050? I think it depends on how you're influencing the boards, how you're influencing funders, how you're influencing clients and constituents. And Green Leadership Trust, that, of all the organizations that I know of, targeting the board structures of these environmental orgs is not just a smart move, but it's sustainable because, who's going to be ready for 2050? I think it depends on your board.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, Lisa, it's a really interesting time for you to ask that question, considering the state of our world and the government, of latest policies and executive orders that we've all heard about in the news. I think you're right. The white guilt right now is overflowing, and folks are seeing that there's something that they need to do. Partly, as a person who's been here around seeing it for so long, it's a little bit, because we've been looking at these problems this whole time.
It's marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. The folks I'm working with in Southwest Philly, none of this is new information, but it's new to a lot of people, so we'll let them receive it and do with it what they will. But I think I can't name any particular orgs that I think are nailing every facet of this. Right? Sure. What I would say is I've listened to Dr. Carolyn Finney. She spoke once when I saw her, and she talked about these organizations wanting to, get people a seat at the table. But that whole concept is flawed because you're saying you can come in and sit at my table, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, we need to destroy the entire table and just go meet somewhere else and build a whole new one together. If you really want me in on this, if you really want my people and my culture and all that comes with it in on this, then I can't just come into your meeting or just be a board member on your board. In order to do what really needs to be done, we need to start from scratch. We need to get leadership involved that is not who the leadership has always been. And it's got to be top to bottom. You know, I see a lot of folks who have, you know, maybe some educators of color, and then you look up from there and the whole rest of the leadership, management, and the board is all white. You know, what are we telling the people who are coming to our programs and who are working with us if only the people who are on the ground floor are non-white? You know, we need folks at all levels, and we need the people who are in those higher levels, if they are the stopgap and the issue with the progress, with accepting where reality is now, we need them to move on. That's a fact. That's kind of a harsh thing to say, but I think that's the truth. We can't, you know, diversity train it out of everyone. Some people just are not going to buy into this message. And even diversity training right now is somehow also controversial. You know, we heard on the debates last night, which is staggering. So we have a long way to go, and I can't bless any of these organizations just yet, because so far all I've heard is big statements about what they're going to do. I'm going to wait another maybe 365 days and see where those statements actually go.
That's fair. That's fair.
And I think we can judge them a little more clearly, but I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm glad the conversations are being had, but
Right.
You know, it's time.
Elise Marie Tolbert, what are your thoughts? You work with a lot of nonprofit organizations.
I do. I do. I would just say, you know, taking a step back, I always think about this concept of, I guess, even just diversity like this. Nobody builds a house with just a hammer. You use a hammer, you use nails, you use a power saw, you use a screwdriver. And that's because it takes a variety of different types of tools to build something that's strong. And if any of these organizations want to continue to be strong and to be relevant, then I think it's worth noting that they have to use and be able to leverage the ideas, the lived experiences, the expertise of a variety of types of people. And I think what's been really beautiful about this movement for Black Lives is that it's kind of awakened us to the power in our lives. And it's awakened us to the power of who we are and the power of our lives. And as we become more awakened and more conscious of who we are and of how powerful we are, it seems to me that particularly for Black-led organizations, Latino organizations, and people, that if a space is not created in which they are totally welcomed and accepted, then Black people are creating spaces for themselves. And I think that that's definitely demonstrated by the fact that the National Black Environmental Justice Coalition just came back together. It's because they know that they need a space for themselves. So I think that as we try to push policy forward, as we try to push solutions and recommendations forward that are actually relevant and meet the reality, I wish I could say the reality was not that, for instance, that climate change disproportionately impacts Black communities, low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous and Native communities. I wish that, you know, that wasn't the reality, but it is. And so until we actually address the reality and bring people together to, you know, meaningfully involve people, either people will become conscious and start working on their own, or, you know, then, or they just won't be at the table. So I can definitely say that I've seen, particularly just these past few months, like people, organizations, funders scrambled for new programs, right? Scrambled to get out money, scrambled to say, please just take my money recently. And there's a lot of short-term gratification from that. But long-term, I think we have to think about, like Taki said, what kind of society do we want going forward? So I also can't say I've seen anyone do it totally well. I think a lot of people are learning right now too. So the grace that I do give is that people are learning, and yeah, we'll just kind of have to see how this goes. But I think, you know, there's two things that are happening. People, particularly people of color, are kind of coming together themselves, and then these long-standing white-led organizations are also trying to figure out how to diversify.
And can I add a note to those majority white-led organizations? no mission that you have, no 30 word or under mission statement is going to achieve environmental progress if you do not address anti-Black racism and dismantle white supremacy in the environmental movement, right? And when we talk about not being relevant, and when we talk about, meeting the reality, we have to know that the status quo is unsustainable, right? The hybrid of the status quo is unsustainable. Status quo zero, now with no calories, is also not sustainable. That, like, as Bree said, it is not us coming to your restaurant to sit at your table to make your reservation. No, we are we're going to make our own table, and at our table we're going to play WAP with the explicit version, and we're gonna be excellent, and we will thrive. And I think it means something that from what I've seen and what I've been able to experience virtually through the internet, and starting from Black Birders Week, in movements where Black women thrive, we are all uplifted, right? So when we are talking about making a new table, I already know I have some ideas of the things that we need on that table, some of the special tools that we need to make this house a little better, to stand up, a little longer, to be more sustainable for 2050 and whoever else wants to live in there.
Those are very moving words, Taiki. I could not agree more. I'm really enjoying this. I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. We are kind of getting to the end of our time, so I have one last question, and we'll see if we can take questions from the audience. So I encourage you to go in now and submit your questions. There is an African proverb that says, "We who are alive now do not inherit the land from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." And so, what advice would you give, or will you give your loved ones when you're trying to encourage them? And what would you tell them? What would you tell them to read? What would you tell them to listen to? I would love to just hear, and especially for folks who are in the audience, what things inspire you, and what would you encourage them to listen and read? Elise Tolbert.
I was trying to unmute. When I think about that quote that you just delivered, the one thing that comes to mind to me is is how much of reality we're seeing, that to be true with climate change, with global climate change. Our climate has been changing. It has been changing for a long time. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been putting out significantly more greenhouse gases than ever. We've had a blanket over our planet Earth. It's been wonderful, but we have too many layers of this blanket now, and it's significantly changing and altering our Earth's chemistry. And the generations from the past perhaps initially thought that this was great, that they were able to revolutionize life. But our scientists have known for a long time that the lifestyle that we live, the energy that we use to live this lifestyle, has been harming the earth. And I saw a quote on Instagram recently that said, stop putting out fossil fuels, you're killing the planet. And the planet said, no, I'm gonna kill you. And that's true. I mean, the planet is the host for our life. So not only are we killing it, but if this planet is not sustainable, then it's going to kill us. And we've seen that with hurricanes, with tornadoes, with forest fires. It's happening all around. So one thing I would say is that I think youth and young people are keen and are aware of climate change. It is their fight. It is. It really should be everyone's fight. It crosses all sectors, all facets of life. I don't know. I know so many books, but for some reason can't think of any particular book to read.
Shows, podcasts.
I don't really know how to work podcasts.
Okay. Well, we'll move on. If you think of any, we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Brianna, do you have any thoughts or any recommendations?
For me, I don't have as many readings per se. I think who I'd tell them to listen to is some of the elders, and people think elders are thinking like folks way, way back. I'm thinking of people who are just right beyond me. That counts as my elders too, right? Like I want to listen to Drew Lanham. I want to listen to Dr. Carolyn Finney. I want to listen to all these people who have already been marching forward with this environmental movement and how they did it. And it was probably different, when they were our age doing this stuff, but we can learn a lot from it. So that would be my advice. And then the second piece I would give youth is we just got to be comfortable taking up space. I think a lot of times we have this imposter syndrome of like, do I know enough to be here? Am I enough of a scientist to talk to this group? We need to be okay with taking up space and getting in the rooms where the decisions are being made and not discounting ourselves before we ever even get in the door. People want you to be there. Some of them might not, but we still have to make a space there. I told some of my former, summer interns who were young, right, at the start of their careers, I'm like, you're great. I want you to kind of start acting like an older white dude sometimes. They act like they always should be there, making a decision, don't they? Like once in a while, we can employ that and really make a way. Somebody else who I like is Christopher Emden, who does hip hop ed, and he's a teacher, has some great tactics and great ways to let students present the way that they want to present and share and be really culturally responsive and relevant. So that's just a few of them that I like, but there's so many people out there saying so much good stuff. I don't want to even limit you down to voices, but your voice is important as well, and it deserves a space in the room.
Taiki.
So I have a microphone because I have a podcast, and I would be remiss. I would be ashamed if I didn't.
We were wondering why you had this amazing setup.
Thank you so much.
The sound is great.
I'm doing what I can out here. So I am the host of On Word for Wildlife, which is a podcast on Wildlife Observer Network that focuses on the intersection of politics and wildlife conservation. My first episode, I talked about federal cruelty toward coyotes, which, is a whole, it was very illuminating, had a lot of fun. Jasmine Murphy was on that. Jasmine Murphy, who also Black mammalogist from Black Mammalogist Week, shout out. And also shout out to the Think 100 podcast, The Coolest Show on climate change, Reverend Yeargood. When you talk about elders, great elder, great somebody to listen to inspire and be admired from. But when it comes down to advice, I would say normalize, rationalize, and organize. Normalize your values, right? You don't have the answers. And we're walking a path where there are questions that are being asked, perhaps for the first time. And so, yeah, you're not going to have an answer, and I wouldn't even expect you to. But you do have to have your values. Your values cannot be doubted, cannot be confused, cannot be ambiguous. Normalize your values, because that's going to be what you can rely on and be proud of after you make your decision, regardless of having all the facts, having all the answers. Rationalize. Now that's something that's more of an organizational advice, but rationalize your rules. There are so many rules, fake and real, in organizations that disconnect people, that don't allow for co-creation, and co-creation is just so important. And as we mentioned before, when you're saying, come to my restaurant, come to my table at my reservation, well, what are the rules? How can we change the rules so that this is a co-creative process and not one that is so linear? And on organize can happen in a lot of ways. You can organize in a group chat, you can organize in an affinity group, you can organize as a union, but the point of that is organizing your power, because the status quo will seek to divide that power in any way and will try to make it seem normal that you're not powerful. But the thing is, when you organize, you are, and you need that power, because this is a time, I think this is an era of inspiration, right? And part of that inspiration is going to go into the many movements that we need to make the world what it needs to be, so that when 2050 is looking back, they're saying, hey, we're proud that these folks not only stood up and did something, but they did it on the considerations of where we are going to be in the future. And we're doing it today so that we are sustainable and ready for that future. And I'm definitely proud to play my role in it in any way that I can. Starting from Black Birders Week, or even if it was the first bird that I've seen back in West Philly. This is definitely something that, my path isn't a path I would recommend for everyone, but I think that everybody has a place in the movement. And I think we all have a shared responsibility in making sure that the path that we are on in this movement is a broad one, and one that allows for constant orientation, so that if somebody is coming on this movement day one, they're ready to take action. They are already inspired.
Yeah.
And drink water every day.
Absolutely. I'm trying to get my 1 gallon in as we speak. Yeah, exactly. So I have a question here in the chat. How can we get EJ to cross over into Black and Latinx liberation spaces? And I will say too, as someone who has studied science and technology policy, the EJ space was new for me, and it does feel very separate from other groups.
I forgot to say, this is the book that I recommend, Organizing for Social Change. It is literally the book for organizing campaigns, like issue-based campaigns, but those issues can be, a lot of things. Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. So how can we get EJ to environmental justice to become more mainstream in Black and Latinx spaces? I feel like we are starting to hear it. Certainly having a Democratic nominee say the word environmental justice, on debate stages and things like that, it, makes me think that it's more mainstream. But do you all have thoughts and ideas for how we can help push the conversation?
At least it's a great question. I think that it's slowly happening. I mean, you have other candidates and things who are just starting to talk about it more. People are hearing about the Green New Deal. That's more like table talk conversation. That's more familiar to folks. But what does all that actually mean? And then how does that boil down to environmental justice? Because it's such a personal thing. I feel like environmental justice is in communities, and it can be incredibly magnified in one place and then completely unknown in another place who doesn't have to deal with that problem at all. So I think the way to do it is magnifying these stories and bringing people to those places. I like when I see panels and events back when we could do things in person, hosted in sites where that issue is prominent, so that all eyes are coming to that area. I think we have to boost different people. I mean, when we have events and stuff like that, you're like, oh, I know this person, and the same group of 10 people are at everything. And they usually look similar and they usually think similar. And that's part of the problem. People aren't always thinking of the environment first and foremost. Now it's becoming a little more in front of your mind because maybe your friend's getting smoked out in California and they had to evacuate. And so you're thinking about climate change.
Right.
But that's in the last, year or so, 6 to 8 months. So while it's starting to appear in people's mind and it's starting to have more connection to the effect the climate has on their regular lives, now is the time to increase space for those voices that have the experience and have the knowledge as well to share the stories of how people are being affected by environmental injustices and have been for the entirety of America all these years up till today. So I think that's part of it. It's just getting the right people in the right places and changing up who is the usual voices.
Yeah, and I would piggy off of Brianna just to say that I think it's really helpful for us to make the connection between the environment and so many other facets of life. Right. To make the connection between the environment and jobs, the environment and policing, the environment and education, the environment and so many other facets of life. And as we start talking to each other more and kind of making the connections, I think that also helps to bring the environment into other movements in which they see that the environment really shapes the outcomes in whatever issue area it is that they're talking about. And I also really agree with magnifying the issues and bringing them forward and connecting the issues to connecting the dots, as Brianna said earlier. Sometimes we think that what's happening in our community is just happening in our community. We don't realize that it's a system and that it's happening on a larger scale. There's a coordinated effort to do whatever is happening. So I think continuing to connect those dots as well and show that each community is not fighting alone, but that they're fighting together towards similar goals and also fighting similar enemies as well, is helpful for magnifying and bringing unity to the conversation.
Well, thank you all so much. We're getting to the end of our time here. I want to remind folks at the beginning, we had our panelists put in their contact information. So if you would like to reach them, just scroll up, you'll see their emails and their Twitter handles. You know, it was really awesome to see you all on National Geographic. I had multiple people sending me the article. And so I look forward to seeing you in, I don't know, the next magazine. I was trying to think of a relevant magazine, but I'm so old. I'm like Vibe? No, I don't think so.
Is Jet over?
Well, I mean, I would like to be in GQ. I could be a GQ cover boy.
Are you
You know, like with my little binocular. Yeah, right. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
Like I'm real keen on Ebony and Essence, you know.
Okay,
All right, let's do those. Like, let's get them all together. All right.
Yeah, for sure.
Are there any final last words that you want to say to our audience, a call to action, or just something that you want to share? I want to give you all the opportunity for a minute or so just to kind of speak off your hearts.
I have one little thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Community-centric fundraising, the first principle of that is that fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. So no matter what your under 30-word mission statement is, the very least that you're doing is that you are fundraising and advancing racial justice. So I threw community-centric fundraising in the chat. Please check it out.
Dope, thanks. Brianna.
I don't have too much to promote. What I will leave you with is my handle. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Ranger_brewery. And I mean, the best thing I can say to move us all forward on creating a better and safer and cleaner world is connecting to the world that's directly outside your door. So if you can, just spend a little bit of time stepping out your door, whatever your door looks like, look in the cracks for some flowers growing, find a tree to sit next to and just convene with for a second. A bird is my personal preference. But the more we can develop the love for nature, especially our very local nature and our very local environment, the more we will be ready to make the changes that we need to do to make the entire globe better for everyone and including our future generations. So thank you for having me today as well. And at least beautifully done with the moderating. Thank you.
Much appreciated. Thank you. Elise Marie.
Well, the first thing I'll say is vote. Just remember to vote. We're in the season of voting, so vote. And voting is not enough. You have to know what you're voting for. So get educated and informed so that you can know who and what you're voting for. And be engaged. Democracy works through our participation. So, you know, life is busy, life is hard. In the span of your life, it's hard to, you know, stay engaged with what your policymakers are doing. But if you had an employee, you would know what they were doing. And these people are your employees because you pay them through your tax dollars. So vote and stay engaged. And we got some tools for organizing from Mr. Taki. We got advice on staying in nature and just stepping outside of your door. I think that's important. The last thing I say is just talk to others around you. On the metro in DC, I would sit right next to someone shoulder to shoulder and they wouldn't even look at me. And I turn to them and say, hello, good morning. And they'd be so shocked. Like, why are you talking to me? But it's so important that we just talk to each other because we have so much to offer each other just as humans. So that's the last piece of advice I give. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here and to have this conversation with all of you all brilliant and inspiring people today.
This was great. Thank you all so much. Again, this was a partnership. The Green Table Talks, we have them monthly. We're working with Black Millennials for Flint, Climate Action Campaign, and the Environmental Defense Fund. So tune in for our next one. And thank you so much, panelists, for taking out this hour of your day.
Thank you. Nice seeing everybody.